Doctor, it would be necessary for you to take an oath. Would you take an oath on the Bible or an affirmation?
I'll take the Bible.
Sorry?
I'll take the Bible.
Bible. Would you take the Bible that's there in your hand, please, and repeat after me? I swear by Almighty God
I swear by Almighty God
that the evidence I shall give in this royal commission
that the evidence I shall give in this royal commission
shall be the truth,
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Thank you. Take a seat, please. Yes, Mr. Stewart.
As Your Honour pleases. Dr. Applewhite, I'll start with a little bit of background. You, from the United States...
I think we need the name, I think.
I beg your pardon. Your full name's Dr. Applewhite.
Monica Lisa Applewhite.
And you furnished a report to the Royal Commission, is that right, dated 22 July 2015?
That's correct.
And two annexes to that report. The one is your letter of instructions from Milton Bray, and the other is a curriculum vitae for yourself, is that right?
That's correct.
Do you confirm that the report is true and correct?
Yes.
I attended the report, Your Honour.
It will become Exhibit 2913.
You are from the United States of America, is that right, Dr. Applewhite?
That's correct.
And you've been engaged by the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society of Australia as an expert witness for the purpose of this hearing, is that right?
That's correct.
And your ordinary work is as a consultant broadly in the area of child sex abuse, is that right?
I've worked in other fields beyond sexual abuse. I also worked with physical abuse and neglect. But the majority of my work has been with sexual abuse in organizations.
And not limited to children?
No, also vulnerable adults as well.
Just by way of background, your primary and secondary education, in other words, your school education, at what nature of institutions were you at school?
Sorry, did you say my primary and secondary?
Yes.
I
In other words, were they faith-based? Was it faith-based school education that you attended?
No, I attended what we would call public school. You would call state school, I think.
Yes. And you're an active Catholic, is that right?
I am.
Yes. And insofar as your tertiary education is concerned, you have a Bachelor of Science in Social Work from the Texas Christian University, Fort Worth, Texas in 1990, is that right?
That's right.
And that university, Texas Christian University, is that particular to any particular denomination within the Christian religion more broadly?
It is. It's affiliated with the Disciples of Christ.
Disciples of Christ.
Yes.
And then you have a Master's of Science in Social Work from the University of Texas at Arlington, 1992, is that right?
That's right.
And a PhD in Social Work, also University of Texas at Arlington, 1995, is that right?
That's correct.
And in your CV that's described as clinical track. Can you explain what that means?
Sure. When you work on your PhD in that particular program, you have two options. And one is a clinical track, which would focus more on therapeutic types of work. And the other is an administrative track that would focus on being responsible for nonprofit organizations that would provide social service to groups of people.
And is that a PhD by dissertation alone or part dissertation and part coursework?
There's coursework, and then you do a dissertation at the end.
Right. And proportionately, how, insofar as qualifying for the PhD, how much is allocated to the dissertation as opposed to the coursework?
It depends on the person, how long it takes them to get their PhD, to get their dissertation completed, but roughly speaking, I'd say 2/3 coursework, 1/3 dissertation.
And the dissertation, how long is it?
How long is it?
Yes, in words.
Oh, I have no idea.
Your PhD, they didn't specify it has to be...
A certain number of words?
Yes. No.
Not that I recall.
All right, thank you. And your PhD dissertation is entitled A Logical Regression Model on the Decision-Making Process of Women in Abusive Relationships. Is that right?
That's correct.
Right. And that's, I would understand from the title, not to do with or relevant to child sexual abuse particularly.
Not particularly. It was women who were in abusive relationships making decisions whether to stay or to leave an abusive partner.
And did you publish your dissertation?
I did not.
And have you published any peer-reviewed publications?
I have not.
In your CV, you mention a couple of publications that you do have, and that's on page 7 of the CV. That's at Ringtail 23.
Yes.
You've only listed 2 there. I understand there are others. Is that right?
Things that I've written have been published in online educational programs. I have a couple of chapters now that have been published, but none of those are peer-reviewed articles, if that's the question.
And the first one you have there, Putting Abuse in Context, America magazine, September 2006. America magazine is a magazine published by the Order of Jesuits, is that right?
Yes, it's a Jesuit publication.
Yes. And the second publication you have there, Human Development magazine, is a Catholic magazine, is that right? Or journal?
Yes, it's a Catholic magazine.
Yeah, and you're on the board of that, the editorial board of that journal?
Yes.
Now, insofar as your work history and experience is concerned, I understand from your CV that you were first employed in 1992 in a consulting firm, is that right?
That's correct.
And you worked with that firm until 2007?
That's correct.
And thereafter you've worked as an independent consultant in essentially your own consultancy, is that right?
That's correct.
And if I have it correctly, you've not worked in a service delivery organization per se, have you?
I have worked in service delivery organizations while I was still working on my PhD or working on my master's degree or working on my bachelor's degree. Throughout the time I was in school, I had to work.
And let's leave school aside. In the time period of your postgraduate education, what were the nature of the service delivery organizations you worked in?
They were residential treatment programs for children, day treatment programs for children, mostly for children who had experienced emotional, physical, sexual abuse, and had emotional and behavioral problems as a result.
And the nature of your work in those institutions?
I did social work, I did social intake work, I facilitated groups.
And was some of that part of your training as a social worker?
Yes.
In other words, linked to your academic work?
Some was part, I worked in practicums while I was in school, and I also worked to pay for school.
All right, thank you. Now, one of the things that's important in this area of, broadly speaking, child safety or the prevention of child sexual abuse in organizations is the question of standards. Have you ever developed such standards? In other words, standards of practice for the reporting or prevention of child sexual abuse in religious organizations specifically?
Could I just clarify the language, standards of practice? I've worked to figure out and determine what were the standards of care in a particular time frame. And when I say standard of care, I mean what would be a reasonable expectation of an organization in a particular time frame, given the information that was available through professional research, the guidelines that were available, the criminal justice system. So that would be a standard of care. And then there's also best practice, which is recommendations that I would make, that I would advocate that a better way of doing things would be this type of a practice. And so I don't usually use the word standard of practice. I would say standard of care and best practice.
All right, so insofar as standard of care is concerned, what you've indicated, if I understand you correctly, is you've looked back historically and identified what seemed to you to be the standards that were applicable at a particular time. Is that right?
Yes.
And insofar as best practice is concerned, that would be looking at any current point in time as to what you would regard to be best organizational practice. Is that right?
Yes.
Insofar as developing best practice is concerned, can you identify in your CV, where you've outlined a lot of the work that you've done in different organizations, which of those has involved that? In other words, which of that work has involved developing best practice or advising on best practice?
Sure. So even beginning back at the beginning of the work in 1992, the purpose, so from 1992 until today, the purpose of the educational programs that I provide and the consulting that I provide is to work with an individual organization to help them figure out how to better prevent and respond properly to incidents of abuse. So that would be from the very beginning. Now, what we knew and understood when I started is different than what we know now, but that's always been the purpose, has been to push the organization along to try to figure out, how do you prevent, how do you respond if someone comes and says that they've had an experience of abuse. That's always been the purpose.
So if I'm to understand you correctly, essentially throughout your consulting career, at any particular point in time, you've consulted to organizations where at that point in time you've engaged with them as to what best practice is or should be for their organization. Is that right?
It is. And if I could just clarify where that information first came from. Before I started consulting, I worked conducting root cause analysis of cases and analyzing cases in organizations to figure out at what point could this have been prevented? At what point could this have been responded to more quickly? Were there warning signs? And if there were, and typically you can find something that could be fixed, then to figure out how that could be implemented as a prevention process in an organization. So once you put together 200 or 300 or 400 cases, you begin to see the patterns. I'm sure that you would see the patterns now. When you follow along those patterns and you can figure out where is the piece that can be fixed in, for example, screening and selection, or in supervision, or in opportunities for people to come forward. So that's always been the purpose. And I started consulting after conducting research.
And that research, in what way were those cases, the hundreds you've spoken of cases, presented to you, and how did you get access to them?
Originally, there weren't hundreds and hundreds. The way that we started was working with organizations that already, we had a group of consultants and already had contacts with organizations, and asked them to help us identify cases that we could analyze. There were also some publicized cases that had been publicized through the legal system, and so you could use those cases. And as we began consulting and as I began doing the work, we could add the cases that in the early days, when somebody would call and say, we want to figure out a prevention plan in 1993 or 1994, almost invariably there had been some cases in their organization. And so we would accumulate those cases that way.
And I take it you learned a lot from the analysis of those cases.
I did learn a lot from analysis of those cases.
And you didn't publish the outcomes of that analysis, as I understand it.
We do not.
Is there a reason for that? I would have thought that others might have found your work in that area valuable had it been published.
That's true. The trouble was that the way that the cases were identified and the way that they could be analyzed was not up to the rigors of empirical research in that way. When you begin to make generalizations and publish an article that says this is everything that we've found, you can have anecdotal evidence and say this is what we found in this case, this is what we found in that case, but oftentimes the amount of information you have about a particular case will vary from organization to organization. When you came along, were you able to do interviews? And there was so much in research methodology that didn't bring it up to the standards to be published in that way.
In the period post-2007, in other words, when you had your own consultancy, with reference to the particular work identified in your CV, can you identify for us which of those items of work or engagements involved the review or presentation of best practice in the organization?
From 2007 to the present?
Yes. So in other words, I'm looking at page 2 of your CV.
Yes.
That's Intel 18.
And your specific question is what involved the review and development?
Yeah, the review of or development of best practice in the organization.
The review, the risk assessment in Milton Hershey School. It's a little bit difficult for me to talk about that because so much of what I have to do isn't on behalf of a specific organization. So in order to continuously know what is best practice, you have to continuously read the empirical research. You have to continuously apply findings from various organizations. So in some ways it's all tied in, but I think that what you're asking me is when was I reviewing their practices to give them feedback?
Well, to use your terminology, let me rephrase it. Reviewing their particular standards of care and advising on their best practice, in other words, what their best or better practice should be.
Okay. So the way that I would do that normally, for example, the risk assessment at Milton Hershey School, and that's a school that provides education for impoverished children.
Yes.
So what I would do, and what I did, is look at everything that they're doing in terms of their practices. How do they screen? How do they supervise? And then compare those with what would be the standard of care or what would be expected in an industry that's similar to theirs. And then if there's anything from a risk management perspective that could be helpful to bring them to an even better practice, then I would make that recommendation.
All right, just before you go on and identify the next one and so on, because I'm going to ask you just to identify each one, but you mentioned there the standards of care in the industry. What do you have reference to identify what is the standard of care?
So it depends on the industry, because in a place where there's accreditation standards, those would clearly be the standards of care. Many of the organizations I work with don't have accreditation or don't have a particular set of standards that have been imposed, but they have to figure those out. So the other places that I would look would be the guidelines that have been given through a governmental entity, the publications that are available for those types of organizations, what similar organizations are doing, if it's been found, for example, the Department of Education has published a study perhaps on peer-to-peer, student-to-student abuse, and they have recommendations. So any of those would be reference points for the particular type of organization.
Can I just understand something? Your CV includes a list of the organisations which you refer to as specific client organisations.
Yes.
Now, just taking the religious organisations, I haven't counted them up. There's a lot of them.
There's a lot. I've worked a great deal with religious organizations.
Are you telling us that you've gone in and done separate work with each of these separate religious organisations?
Yes.
True. How many are there?
Well, one of the reasons that there's so many is that in the United States, when the Catholic Church developed programs for dioceses under the Charter for the Protection of Children and Young People, the Conference of Major Superiors of Men also developed a program, and I oversaw the implementation of that program, and during that time worked with many individual religious orders and congregations of men.
So when you say you oversaw the program, a program was developed and then you participated in its implementation. Is that what you're saying?
I worked with them to develop the program of accreditation.
So
and
who
then
did you work with for that?
The Conference of Major Superiors of Men.
So that's an overarching body.
Yeah, Dr. Jason Morrison, theologist again. I just want to say thank you for watching the videos, and I hope you got plenty of self-rediscovery and freedom out of it. If you watched it on YouTube, please share or like, maybe even comment. If you watched it on Facebook, like, comment, share. But most of all, get out and live. This isn't a rehearsal. You've got a one-off life. Don't let your loyalty and your faithfulness blind you to the life that you should be experiencing. Till the next video, thank you for watching, and bye for now.